This clip from LBC has really got people on the right fuming.
What we've got at the moment is an aristocracy of wealth in this country. It's also true of the United States as well. So what I would do, and I wouldn't be opposed to, by the way, I wouldn't be opposed to 100% inheritance tax. Or maybe let's say 99%. You know, my rule might be that if you can put it in 2p bags, then you can hand it over. That's fine. 99, 95%. I'm being provocative, but you see what I mean. I would not be against a far higher rate of inheritance tax than we have at the moment, which is 40% above a certain threshold. I wouldn't be opposed to putting that to 50%, 60%, 70%. Why? Because I think the quid pro quo should be twofold. One, that helps fund public services, which actually helps level the playing field in achieving a true meritocracy. Two, it will help us reduce taxes on income. Because at the end of the day, I want to incentivize work. I want to incentivize productivity. I want to incentivize people to get up off their backsides and do more. You don't have a right to inherit. You should have a right to work while you're alive and keep more of your own money. That to me is more important, way more important than your right to just inherit some money from mummy and daddy that you did nothing to earn.
So I think that was meant to be fairly provocative, and it did the job because it got 7 million views on Twitter, largely because it angered so many right-wingers. Let's go through some of them. So Kelly J. Keane is a prominent TERF, I think. She said, "Piss off. Most of us love our children and work to help them as much as possible. I'm sorry your family don't feel the same about you." Seems a bit unfair for people who might not have an inheritance to pass on. That doesn't mean they didn't love their kids. Ex-Reform Deputy Leader Ben Habib said this: "Inheritance tax is an assault on ownership and, in turn, Western capitalism. It is also an attack on families and aspiration. Ask any small business owner, farmer, or caring parent. IHT is deeply damaging." That's interesting. I kind of associate inheritance to some degree with feudalism. You know, like you sort of inherit the land of your family, and that's how sort of wealth is, or the rich, I suppose, are people who inherited money as opposed to doing something a bit innovative. But he thinks it's essential to Western capitalism. Tony Bello is a former boxer. "So I've gone to work to earn it for my kids to give them a better life. I've paid millions of tax already. And then you want to tax my kids on the money that's already been taxed like 5 times over. You're obviously not a parent or a decent, rational thinking person. You shouldn't be on air." Now, there is a problem for those in favor of a very high inheritance tax. Because while, you know, to the average Novara viewer, those tweets might seem extreme, opposition to inheritance tax is far from an extreme position. So this is a graphic which shows you how people feel about various taxes. It's from Ipsos Mori, and you can see they've ranked the different types of taxes from fair to least fair. And people said the most fair tax, or 49% of people think it's fair to tax incomes on incomes over 125,000 people. Only 20% think that's unfair. So that's very popular. Tobacco and alcohol duty, also very popular. Income tax, national insurance. People see all of these as quite fair. Now, at the very bottom, the least popular tax, the tax that the least number of people think is fair, is inheritance tax. Only 23% of the public think inheritance tax is fair, and 43% think it is unfair. So while Lewis Goodall's argument might not have sounded controversial to many of our viewers, he is going against the grain, which is surprising. It surprises lots of people because only 3.7% of the population actually pay inheritance tax when they pass away. And it's not sort of surprising why. That's because the threshold is very, very high. So any estate below £500,000 is untaxed if it includes a family home. And that goes up to £1 million if the estate is a family home owned by a couple. So that's really not going to apply to many people. And of course, the 40% tax only kicks in above that £1 million, right? So you're still going to be able to pass on a decent amount of money. So to me, it seems eminently fair. And I actually agree with you, Lewis Goodall, that it should be higher. The tax should be higher. And it seems like a tax Labour are considering tweaking to try and raise more money at the next budget. So earlier this month, government sources briefed The Guardian that Rachel Reeves might reform inheritance taxes. The article said this: At present, gifts made 7 years before someone dies are not subject to inheritance tax, while those given 3 to 7 years before death are taxed on a sliding scale known as taper relief, with the rate reducing each year from 32% to 8%. A lifetime cap could be introduced to limit the amount of money or value of assets an individual can donate as part of their IHT planning, and the Treasury is also reviewing rules around the taper rate. People familiar with the matter said, I'm a source with knowledge of the work, told The Guardian. With so much wealth stored in assets like houses that have shot up in value, we have to find ways to better tap into the inheritances of those who can afford to contribute more. It's hard to make sure these taxes don't end up with loopholes that undermine their purpose, but we are trying to work out what revenue might be raised and how to ensure it's a fair approach. So this isn't a policy announcement from the Labour Party. I think they're kite flying, basically. So they're before the budget, where Rachel Reeves needs to make some money. They're briefing various newspapers about what they might do to see which gets the biggest pushback. I don't think they want, another mistake of what they did with the winter fuel allowance, where they sort of sprung it on the public and were completely shocked by how much people hated it. So now they're sort of trailing everything in advance. And if enough people say they don't like it, they'll say, oh God, we'll look for something else then. To be clear, this particular briefing wasn't suggesting raising inheritance tax, but making it harder to avoid it by saying that you can't just give your house to your children. And if you survive another 7 years, that means it doesn't get taxed at all. I'm now joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Are you on the side of Lewis Goodall or his critics?
Oh, I am 100% on the side of Lewis on this one. I'm going to say something controversial here, which a lot of people aren't going to like. I think inheritance tax is the most moral tax. It is the most moral tax, right? Because every other stage of some level of taxation, you can at least have some kind of understanding that at least something was done to deserve the money that is being made in that particular transaction, right? Obviously, if you work, you're productive, that makes sense, you get rewarded for this. Even something like capital gains or a share dividend, right? You can at the very least, someone with a different political perspective to me, it's still making money out of money, but at the very least, you've made and taken a risk in owning an asset that is going to appreciate in value, or that you have taken a risk in investing in a company, and then you've been paid dividends based upon that smart investment, right? I don't think this is a good use of money. I think capital gains tax should be higher, but at least you can justify that in terms of deserving remuneration for doing something of value. Inheritance is totally valueless, right? First of all, the person who is actually passing it down is dead. And people keep saying, oh, you're taxing the dead as if that's somehow a bad thing. I'm like, no, by all means, tax dead people. They're not going to care, are they? And when it comes to people who are actually inheriting the wealth, inheriting the assets, inheriting the money, they have done quite literally nothing other than winning the uterus lottery. They've been born into a situation completely outside of their own control. And people who have inherited this wealth have done nothing of value that you can ascribe to what they're inheriting. And it's just, well, it should be the choice of the person with that money to pass it down to their kids. They should decide what to do. It's already being taxed. First of all, everything's already being taxed, every transaction. There's no such thing as double taxation. That's a nonsense right-wing canard. I'm just going to dismiss that out of hand regardless. And when it comes to what you want to do with your money, I'm like, well, I understand that, but money as a concept is used as a token to represent distribution. Why is there so social utility in your decision to give that all to your kids? Do they deserve it more than, I don't know, the state that helped fund all of the social infrastructure that allowed you to amass that wealth in the first place? Because that's necessary, right? People like to say, oh, I'm a self-made millionaire, I'm a self-made person in terms of the wealth. I'm like, well, are you really self-made when every single point of engagement with the economy relies on state infrastructure and public infrastructure that exists to facilitate you making that money in the first place? What I will say, though, is that regardless of these moral arguments, we don't actually live in a world where people understand it being totally meritocratic. There is no desert theory, right? This idea that you get the money in society that you deserve. Because that doesn't apply at any single point of the production function. It doesn't matter whether you own the resources, whether you're doing the labor, whether you own the capital, or you're the innovator that created the extra technological advancements that increased overall total factor productivity. Doesn't matter which stage that you're in, no one really actually gets the returns on those things based upon how they deserve to be able to get remunerated in that way based upon their contribution to society. Firstly, because it'd be messy to try and calculate that anyway. How could you quantify such a thing? And second of all, as I mentioned before, money is actually just a token we use to represent distribution. How can we optimize? How can we optimize in terms of social utility where that money is used and how best it can be used to benefit society. And I would argue that the most important piece of social utility is ensuring that people are incentivized to be productive. It is, as Lewis points out, actually getting people to go out and work rather than just living off of money and mummy and daddy's money forever, sitting on their backsides playing PlayStation. Like obviously, and when it comes to the estates, it's the wealthiest of estates that pay. Let's make it really, really clear, as you mentioned before, right? But it's not the middle class people who just want to ensure that their kids can at least have something. I'm somebody who stands to inherit enough that would pay at least a small amount of inheritance tax. Happy to pay more. I did nothing at all to deserve that, right? But when it comes to inheritance tax, it is the richest who pay, and they control the media, they control the discourse, and they're the ones who are allowed to be able to manufacture consent in terms of whether or not we view this as being moral or not. And fundamentally, as Lewis correctly points out, we have a situation where it is far easier to be successful. It is far easier to be rich. It is far easier to have a good life in this society if you are born into wealth than if you are a productive and hardworking member of society, because the ways in which we have stratified how people get money in this society is completely topsy-turvy. Not just in terms of who pays tax, but how much money is remunerated to labor rather than capital, or the ownership of natural resources that we've privatized, right? Like, none of these things make any actual utilitarian sense. Now, of course, I know, again, I'm in the minority of being a utilitarian. I know that's not particularly popular ethical philosophy, but fundamentally, none of the arguments I've heard against this have ever been made in such a way that it's in any way convincing. All I hear is whines. Wow, the government's taxing me. I want my kids to be able to not have to work. Well, tough. This is society. Everybody should work. Simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on a number of levels. I mean, I agree with you, I think, on the practical policy implications, because I think inheritance tax should be higher and I think the threshold should be lower. I'm obviously at some point, going to inherit some, or would be in line to inherit some money. I think it would probably be under the threshold because the threshold is so high. But I would happily pay 50% on all of it, from zero to the government. Like, I feel like I didn't earn it. It's, as you say, it's the luck of the uterus or whatever. So I think the idea that you should feel bitter if you only get 50% of something you didn't earn, I think is crazy. But I do think that probably the fact that there is such vast opposition to this from such a sort of wide spectrum of the public probably isn't just because of right-wing misinformation of the sort of 4% of people who will actually ever pay it. I think it probably does say something about people's ethical systems that maybe the left doesn't always quite get. And maybe that's sort of a barrier to us, which is, I think, the way you were sort of talking there, it's sort of the moral unit is the individual, and sort of meritocracy means that you as an individual should earn everything as an individual. And I suppose potentially it's the case that the moral framework of many people is that the moral unit is the family. And to sort of, for the state to get in the way of that moral unit and not just sort of say, oh, let's have a balance between the family and the state, but to say sort of the ability of a parent to leave something to their child after they pass is sort of immoral, is irrelevant. I suppose that sounds unnatural to people. And I suppose I wonder how you think about that and whether sort of the extent of the opposition to this and why it confuses some on the left, including myself. As I say, I think it's probably the fairest tax, not the most unfair tax. But I think maybe we do have to ask ourselves some deeper questions about why does everyone else feel so differently about this beyond they've just been tricked?
I mean, again, I agree with you. As I said before, like, I understand that I am in the moral minority in terms of the ethical positions that I take, right? Like, it's very strictly, I'm a utilitarian. I don't think there's much societal utility in using that particular basis in terms of the family being this internal unit. And again, I don't even believe in meritocracy, really. I believe that we should just have a distribution in terms of the way in which we run state policy, again, that maximizes as much happiness for everybody as possible. And I understand people aren't going to buy into that. People aren't going to buy into that because, again, they prioritize either in terms like a strict libertarian sense, the individual, as you point out, in a kind of liberal sense, or they will have this kind of conservative, like family view about being the close circle being more important than society at large. And I mean, that's probably been one of the biggest fulcrums in the ways in which the left have been pretty marginalized in terms of our overall ethical philosophy for the last however long since capitalism has come into fruition, But fundamentally, I don't necessarily think that when it comes to inheritance tax, everything should 100% hand over to the state, as Lewis Goodall, as you point out, was being provocative over. But the arguments in terms of what's happening to society if we allow entrenched wealth to create this, what you said, I think you're right. It is very feudal. The kind of situation that we have now in this country where some families control huge amounts of society and the bottom level of it have literally nothing. And unless you can find some way of being able to break that up, that entrenched wealth will only get worse over time. And whilst it used to be the case that would trickle away that wealth, I think there was a shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves in 4 generations. I think that's what the phrase was, right? But that is far less likely to happen when the richest families can just put all that money into a blind trust, and that will continue to pay dividends forever for whoever they pass it down to, and they have no reason to ever sell that or to ever put that back into the market, right? You look at the family farm tax stuff that people come out with in the media, that framing that somehow it's killing family farms by making them pay the same inheritance tax as everybody else. First of all, there's ways that you can try and ensure that it makes fewer people pay the inheritance tax if you don't use it as a tax dodge. It means the demand goes down, the value of the land goes down. But fundamentally, no one's given to me an argument that makes sense as to why, well, that farmland has to stay in the family forever. And in fact, like, it's very anti-capitalist. It's very, pre-capitalist. It's not a socialist position. It's a very kind of anti-capitalist Reformation position to say that, well, why should it not be the market that decides, right? The market shouldn't be deciding who gets this land. It should stay within this kind of microcosm of this particular family forever. I guess you're right. We're going to have to try and find a way of explaining this to people. But my value system is kind of so different, I guess, to a lot of other people's, that no one's made any argument to me that undermines my position on this. But I guess, as I said, I'm in the minority.
I think one area where I do really agree with what Lewis Goodall said, and where I think inheritance is quite so toxic, is when it's combined with a society where wealth is so important relative to income. So obviously, if the average income was, 100K a year, and the average house was worth 100K a year, then when a parent passes down a house, that's a help. You might be able to buy some nice things and great. But at the moment, because a house costs sort of 20 years of income, that does mean that you have this terrible divide between people whose parents own property and people whose parents don't, whereby if you've worked really hard all your life and you're on a decent salary, but your parents lived in a council house or rented, but your best mate has worked, just as hard as you, and then their parents own property and then they pass away, suddenly your mate is twice as rich as you, right? Through, as everyone in this conversation has been saying, the luck of the draw. So I think I think it would be a losing argument for the left to say sort of there's something unnatural about inheritance, but I do think that probably the winning argument, well, it's not winning because there's so many bloody homeowners, and if you sort of create a policy which makes house prices fall, which is ultimately what you have to do to end the stranglehold of wealth over the economy, it's really, really difficult actually politically. I shouldn't say it's easy. But I do think the inheritance debate would be the inheritance issue would be much less toxic if wages were more important compared to wealth. And we live in a society for the past few decades where wealth, and especially wealth tied up in houses, is just ever more important compared to the people or the money you get from the work you do every day.